Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'm going to be giving you guys an almost speculation video on the type of figures that I expect to see as part of the Transformers Studio Series line. I know there are many of you out there who are in fact worried that we may indeed be running out of characters, but I'm pretty certain that this list is going to put a lot of minds to rest, as there is in fact so many potential characters that Hasbro and Takara Tomy are yet to approach, those including figures that we haven't as of yet seen any versions of, and then those who perhaps we can see slight alterations / variants of. Now I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below on some of the figures that I will indeed mention in this list, and if I do happen to leave any of them off, also be sure to let me know down in the comments. There are some that I've left off just simply because I don't think they stand a chance of ever getting a release, such as Reedman, that weird looking thing that we saw in Transformers Revenge of the Fallen that actually sliced the glass in order to remove the shard of the Allspark. I don't actually think we're ever going to see a figure of that, so that didn't make it onto the list, nor did Revenge of the Fallen Alice, as I think just practicality wise that figure is way off the cards. And you guys all know the Studio Series is my favourite main line. It focuses primarily on live action movie figures, so I thought that this list was not only good for you guys but also good for me, as I too was also a little worried that the line may in fact actually be expiring fairly shortly, especially with the introduction of the 86 line. So without further ado, we'll kickstart things off with the Transformers 2007 movie. Now straight off the bat, when you actually think about it, we've pretty much gotten all of the main characters from that film. We've got the entire Decepticon cast as well as the entire first Autobot cast, but of course there are a couple of variations that we haven't as of yet seen that I personally would really like. So straight off the bat, we're missing Frenzy. Now Frenzy, of course, whilst he wasn't the biggest Decepticon character in the movie, he is one that I'm pretty certain many of you guys would like to see. I personally would have loved to have gotten him maybe packaged in with the Voyager class Megatron. Sadly that never in fact actually happened, so Frenzy is definitely a figure that I'm really hoping to see. And to be fair, some of the previous figures we've seen of him haven't actually been too bad at all. I am aware that there was an almost action battler which transformed into an actual radio, so if they could do something very similar to that, especially now that we've got the core class in the Studio Series line, that would be super awesome. Or maybe we could in fact see a smaller version of Frenzy actually repacked with another figure that I have on that list, that being the NBE-1. Now you're all probably thinking NBE-1 is Megatron, and we've already seen a first live action movie Megatron. Well yes, but I personally would love to see a variation of that figure done in the Frozen Megatron colour scheme. Now the Frozen Megatron colour scheme is of course a figure that we actually saw as part of the original 2007 toy line, so not only with the introduction of this guy being incredibly nostalgic, but I also think it is a variation that we need in the collection. Throughout the movie we do in fact actually see Frozen Megatron multiple times, and of course you could in fact actually reissue it as an NBE-1 version. You know, we haven't in fact actually seen the NBE-1 title used on a Megatron toy so far, so I personally think that it would be a great use of the name, and in my personal opinion I'd love to see that first movie Voyager Megatron figure actually redecoed to have an almost Ice Age colour scheme. I think it would look super cool, and once again it's a very unique variation. Then we move on to some of the Cybertronian protoforms. Now these I actually think may in fact happen. We did in fact actually get some Cybertronian protoforms as part of the first live action movie line. Some that jump to mind would be Optimus Prime as well as Starscream. I believe they were some of the first figures to actually come out for the Transformers movie, and we do in fact actually see these in the film. Of course Optimus Prime crash lands into Earth. I think we see Jazz. I'm almost pretty certain we saw Ironhide and Ratchet as well, so I do think that Cybertronian protoforms are on the cards, maybe even if they just sort of rework the older versions and reintroduce them into this line. As to be fair, considering they're well over a decade now, I do definitely think those molds stand the test of time. In terms of other Decepticons, I think we could see the Mountain Dew bot. Now, and the only reason why I'm saying this is because we did in fact actually get a movie advanced version of this guy in the Age of Extinction Takara subline. It was essentially just a redeco of a 2007 movie figure, but I really do think they could do this. I think it would be pretty cool. Once again, a very distinct Decepticon, something that we don't really get many of nowadays. It would of course have to be a fully licensed figure in order to actually sport some of those Mountain Dew decos, but I really think they could do it. Not only would it be a really cool figure, but it would also be a very unique one, as we don't really get many Dispensor type characters of which can actually transform in the live action movie line. And then a figure which I think is maybe less likely, just as we've kind of already seen it already, would be a Scorponok. Now whilst I did actually really like the detailing that we got on the Scorponok that came packaged with the Studio Series Leader Class Blackout, personally, now we've seen that the core class is introduced into this line, I think Hasbro and Takara can give us a much better version, a much larger version, a much more detailed version, one that's a little more articulated, and of course one that can actually transform. Now granted, we don't actually see Scorponok retain an alt mode in the movies, but I would actually really like to see them maybe adapt something like they did for the first movie, where they gave him this really weird, almost humanoid fan mode. It was pretty cool in my opinion, so once again I would actually really love to see Scorponok revisited. And that was essentially all of the characters that I could come up with in terms of the 2007 Transformers movie. Then we jump into Revenge of the Fallen. Surprisingly, actually quite a few characters, despite actually having all of the Constructicons, the main Decepticon team as well as Autobots. I've come up once again with quite a few picks. So straight off the bat, figures that I would love to see would be Skids and Mudflap, both in their modernized vehicle modes, as well as in their ice cream truck modes. Now, I know there will be many of you who think that these guys are more than likely never going to happen due to the whole controversial aspect of these characters, but personally, I think that many fans would love them. I, for one, would definitely love at least the ice cream twins. I thought they were a great concept. The original ROTF deluxe figure that we got of those guys was really, really impressive, so to see an updated representation of these, I think would be really awesome. And I personally really loved the actual characters of Skids and Mudflap. I thought they were a great breath of fresh air. Of course, as time has sort of progressed, they may be slightly dated, but I actually really think that they would be cool characters, and once again, they really are some of the essential Autobots that we would need in order to fill in the ranks for the Transformers ROTF cast. Now, in terms of a scale class, originally I packed them in the core class, but then when you think of core class, they are very small, and I just don't think they'd actually be able to get their vehicle modes in scale with the rest of the team. So I'm thinking maybe a 2-pack of deluxe figures like we saw with the Elita 1, Chromia, and RC pack, but of course just with 2 smaller sized deluxes. I think we could definitely be onto something there, and once again, these are figures that I'd really love to see. Now, a character of which I included, but I do think is slightly unlikely, would be Wheelie. Now, of course, we also saw Wheelie packaged with Dark the Moon Shockwave. He was tiny, so that really is the only reason why I think maybe we're never going to see him, just as because even if they did make a core class of that guy, he would be super, super small, way too small to in fact actually scale with the rest of the team. So they would in fact have to upscale him, and of course he just wouldn't be in scale with the rest of the characters, but still it'd be one that I'd like to see them perhaps produce. I do know that there was a Scout class Wheelie in the original ROTF toy line, so once again it would be pretty cool to see that guy actually be able to transform, unlike that miniature slug version that of course came with Shockwave. Now, number 3 would have to be the Fallen. Now, I know there are heavy rumours suggesting that we may in fact actually be getting this guy finally in 2022, but no solid concrete confirmation at the time of this recording, so I put him on this list. In all honesty, I'm surprised we hadn't got this figure 2 years before. I really do think Hasbro are way too slack in actually giving us the Fallen. He should have been one of the first Decepticons that they actually put out, especially considering that essentially he was the main antagonist of the Revenge of the Fallen movie. I'd love to see what they could do with him. I thought the Hunt for the Decepticons version that actually had the removable battle damage face was super cool. I thought the robot mode was so accurate, and of course the staff weapon was wicked. The only thing that really let that guy down was the limitation in terms of articulation as well as the colour scheme. So really and truly, I'd be quite happy if they just merely took that mold, updated it with new paint apps, maybe changed a few of the articulation joints and repackaged it, as I thought it was an awesome figure. But the Fallen is definitely going to happen sooner rather than later. This time next year, I may in fact already have this guy up over on the channel for a review, so here's hoping that is indeed a possibility. Then I decided to pack on the list Scalpel. Now, this guy once again is one that I think maybe is slightly more unlikely. If we ever were to see him, he would definitely have to be a core class. He was that crazy Cybertronian doctor that of course was going to cut Sam Witwicky's brain out of his own head in order to actually examine some of those symbols that he had going on in his head. I thought he was a really cool character. Of course, we did in fact actually get a massive deluxe class figure of him in the original ROTF toy line, so once again, not all that in scale, and if they were to produce him, he would have to be tiny. So I do think this guy sadly is on the unlikely side. Then we jump into a figure of which I think Hasbro and Takara would be absolutely bat crazy not to give us, that being Demolisher. Now, Demolisher is essentially just a white repaint of Scavenger. He was one of the first Decepticons that we saw in the ROTF movie, of course. He's very quickly taken down by Prime and Ironhide in Shanghai, and of course delivered that awesome message that the Fallen shall rise again. Why we haven't seen this guy already, I honestly do not know. Scavenger's been out for almost 2 years now, so really quite surprised that we haven't as of yet seen the Demolisher repaint, as it literally would be so simple just to recolor him white and of course reissue him. Then we jump into another figure of which is too heavily rumoured, that being Sideways. Now, once again, much like the Fallen, we could see this guy as early as next year, and I'm really looking forward to him. I thought the original deluxe figure was great, but of course we need a proper in-scale, hopefully a fully licensed Audi in order to actually pair against the ROTF Sideswipe. This is one that I know that they're going to produce. It is just a matter of when and how, as of course even the original figure didn't have an official licensed vehicle, but that didn't really stop them with Dino/Mirage. Then some characters of which I think are slightly unlikely, but still ones that I'd really like to see, would be some of the Decepticon protoforms that we primarily see roaming around Egypt. They had very distinctive alien-looking robot modes, and to be fair, if they actually produced some of those Cybertronian protoforms that I discussed as part of the first movie list, then they could just literally retool them with like an almost blackout head, and there you'd have the Decepticon protoforms, and they could also reissue them for the Dark the Moon line, as of course we did also see a few of them then. And then the final figure that I have for the ROTF lineup, honestly, if we don't get this figure, I think Hasbro are nuts, and this is one that I'm so surprised that we haven't already seen, considering how much they love repaints and retools. A battle-damaged Optimus Prime based on the Forest Fire, or the dead Optimus Prime. Honestly, this would be so awesome. All they'd have to do is take the first 2007 movie Optimus Prime, retool the chest unit, and the chest unit, due to combining with Jetfire, actually removes, so they could reinsert a brand new piece with, of course, that cutout where Megatron smashes his blade through his chest. They could could in fact actually give us the mouth guardless look for the faceplate, which I think would be really cool. Of course, they could actually package in the battle hooks instead of the iron blaster, as well as the blades. We haven't seen the battle hooks yet, so this is definitely a variant that I'm really hoping they put out, as I think it would be super cool. And considering we've got battle damage Megatron, I think that it's only a matter of time before eventually we get the battle damaged Optimus Prime. Then we move into the 2011 Dark of the Moon movie. Now, surprisingly, there are actually quite a few characters of which they haven't made yet. I thought that they'd pretty much covered everyone, but nope, there still are quite a few big ones. So straight away, I'd love to see a reissue of Ironhide, of course done in his Dark of the Moon getup with the shotguns instead of the shoulder cannons, and with this they could also retool the bumper section and the torso, much like we've seen with some of the other figures like that Optimus Prime. We've got the original SS-05, and then we got a reissue in the SS-32, which was of course an improved version of SS-05, so I'm hoping they could do that here with Ironhide, just sort of retweak him, make him a little better. He is in fact a very difficult figure to find, so it'd be great for those who perhaps missed up on him the first time round, and to include his shotguns would just be super cool. If they really wanted to go all out there, they could in fact actually give him a rusty colour scheme in order to give you the impression that of course he's been blasted in the back by Sentinel Prime. Also, Dark of the Moon Bumblebee, this is a figure that I know also is rumoured to come out in 2022. This one's definitely going to happen sooner or later. We've seen so many Bumblebees in this line so far. We've already seen a Revenge of the Fallen version. We've got 2 versions for the first live action movie, so it is about time they gave us the Dark of the Moon release. I'm expecting a really heavy retool where the chest unit is concerned, and hopefully a brand new head sculpt. That would just be so cool, and of course some modifications made to the alt mode in order to actually make it that 2011 Camaro. Another big character that they're yet to give us would be Q/Wheeljack. This is one that also I think is just a matter of time as to when they actually put this out. I think it's definitely coming, but as of yet I don't believe there are any rumours for the foreseeable future, so I think it's unlikely that we're going to see it next year, maybe in 2023, but then considering Rise of the Beasts is coming out that time, they're going to be pretty hectic, so it may even be as late as 2024, but at least we'll finally get him. I really do think he's on the cards, as Hasbro do of course actually have the license for Mercedes as seen by Dark of the Moon Soundwave. I also put on the list Dark of the Moon Skids and Mudflap. Once again, this really does just depend on whether or not we in fact actually get Revenge of the Fallen versions. Of course, all they'd really have to do for Skids would be recolour him with a predominantly black colour scheme, whereas with Mudflap they would have to completely reshell the vehicle mode in order to match Skids, as he was very different when in comparison to his vehicle form in Revenge of the Fallen, but he's never in fact actually ever really appeared in Dark of the Moon, so this could also be a release of which he's on the slightly less likely side. I've also decided to pack down the Driller. Now, the Driller is a really interesting character in the movie. It was enormous, and in all honesty, I'd say that it's pretty unlikely, but I do think that it is possible. Maybe they could give us a slightly smaller version of the Driller, maybe just the head section, and then maybe a little bit of the body in a leader class package. I think that would look really cool, and it would make for an awesome companion slash set piece to go alongside the Dark of the Moon Shockwave. I thought the Driller was one of the most interesting visuals to come out of the entire live action Michael Bay saga, so really hoping that eventually we can see a Driller, and of course it'd be awesome to pair him off against the Jetwing Optimus Prime. I've also put down here Dark of the Moon Barricade with a gun, so simple reuse of the first movie Barricade, of course this time just coming with the blaster that he uses in order to actually execute Q within the movie. And then I've also put down a fan favourite, that being DevCon. Now this one is very unlikely I think at the time of this recording, unless Hasbro did decide to delve into some of the slightly more obscure live action characters and maybe even some of the concept characters. I think this guy's going to be off the cards for quite some time, but he had a super interesting robot mode, honestly so awesome, and a really interesting looking vehicle mode as well. Definitely one of the most distinguishable Decepticons to come out of those live action movies, and really did look like a brute of force. So really hoping that eventually we can see DevCon. Moving on to some more Decepticons, we have to get Hatchet. Of course, he's the third Dread that we're yet to see. He was probably one of the best Dread designs as well. He transformed into an almost dog wolf thing with all these dreads actually coming off him, so really hoping that eventually we can see him. I did in fact do a throwback review of the Cyberverse version towards the beginning of this year, and I thought that figure was great, so to see what they could come up with in deluxe format, of course modern technology, would be super interesting. I've also put on the list Crankcase, just because the official Crankcase that we got released as part of the Studio Series line was just a rehash of Crowbar. It was so inaccurate and was honestly just dreadful, so definitely would like to see Crankcase. To be fair, all they'd have to do is just repackage Berserker from the Transformers The Last Night, maybe give him a slightly golden colour scheme where the dreads are concerned, and you've essentially got yourself a brand new Crankcase. And then I've also put on another few figures of which I think are slightly more unlikely, that being the Decepticon drones slash gunships. Now they could do something really interesting with this. They could either make this a Voyager or a Deluxe. They could have the actual drone ships that we saw predominantly through the movie. Honestly, they actually have a massive impact in the film, and they can have those transform into actual protoforms. So in a way, you're getting the best of both worlds. As mentioned beforehand, I said that I wanted protoforms in the Revenge of the Fallen line. We could get Decepticon protoforms of which can actually transform into the gunships. I think it would be a super cool concept, great for army building, and once again would be a really interesting take on a character of which doesn't actually have a toy as of yet. And then finally for Dark of the Moon, I've packed on the list Laserbeak. This too is also a figure of which is heavily rumoured, so once again it's just a matter of time as to when we're going to see him. I think that it's definitely going to be as early as next year, so really looking forward to him. And then we jump into Transformers Age of Extinction. Honestly, what figures have we actually seen from this movie? It's been literally none of them, so this is a massive list. So straight off the bat, I'm really hoping to see a high-octane version of Bumblebee. Now, in all honesty, if you'd asked me a year ago as to whether or not this figure would be possible, I'd say absolutely yes, but very recently we did in fact actually see a repackage of the 2014 high-octane Bumblebee in the Studio Series buzzworthy Bumblebee lineup, and honestly, they actually gave him an actual number within the line, so I'm really hoping that they're not just planning on reissuing that 2014 figure, as let's be honest, whilst it was a decent figure for its time, not the best, it was in fact actually packaged in one of the worst live-action movie lines of all time. They really need to give us a new version. I think they could come up with something so much better, even if they took the actual older version Chimera that we saw as part of the first live-action movie and retooled it. It would be so much better than the actual 2014 high-octane B that we saw in that original AOE toy line. I'd then really like to see a 2014 version of Bumblebee, of course, in his more updated Chimera. I thought that would be a really cool look. Maybe they'd use Stinger as a basis for that, as of course their robot modes were very similar in the movie, but I'm really hoping to see something completely brand new, as of course Stinger wasn't all that great of a figure either. He's in fact one of my lowest ranked Studio Series figures of all time. I just do not think in terms of robot mode he was that great at all. Vehicle mode was awesome, but the robot mode was definitely atrocious. Of course, we've then got to see Crosshairs. This is a figure that we haven't seen since the Last Night toy line, and whilst he did receive a pretty decent toy in that line, it once again wasn't the best, and I definitely do think they could do a lot better. Also, a Bugatti version of Drift. Surprisingly, we did in fact actually see the helicopter version of Drift in the Studio Series, but we've seen nothing as of yet in regards to a Bugatti version, so once again, would really like to see him. And of course, we've got to see Age of Extinction Hound in his Oshkosh tactical defense vehicle. Now, this too is also a figure that I think is on the horizon, but once again, it's just a matter of time as to when. I'm really not expecting it within the next 2 years, maybe 2024, 2025, definitely not next year, and I think very unlikely for 2023. Of course, Evasion Mode Optimus Prime. This is a fan favorite one. This is one that I've been wanting the most, probably out of all of the Optimus Prime variants. I thought we had an awesome vehicle mode, of course, harkening back to the original G1 design, very rusted, very beaten up, and of course, still stuck truthful to the Bayverse design in particular in that robot form, so really looking forward to this guy. And surprisingly, the Evasion Prime that we actually saw for the original 2014 Age of Extinction line was probably one of the best figures that that line had ever seen. So once again, considering they were able to put such an awesome gem in that line, I can only imagine as to what they could produce now with modern technology. With an Evasion Prime, we'd then have to see the more modern, updated Knight version of Optimus Prime. Now, to be fair, I thought the Voyager that we saw for the Last Night wasn't too bad. It was definitely a marked improvement in comparison to anything that we saw for Age of Extinction. So even if they just took that figure, retooled it in order to try and minimize some of the kibble on the backpack, I think we could be looking at a pretty solid release. But this, in all honesty, isn't a variant that I personally am really looking forward to, as the Knight version of Optimus is probably one of my most least favorite designs that we've seen for Prime in the entire live-action movie saga. Of course, we need Galvatron. Now, Galvatron would be such an awesome figure. I did actually recently review over on the channel the Unique Toys version of Galvatron, and honestly, that figure was excellent. So I'd really love to see Hasbro and Takara Tomi's own spin on it. The original version was lackluster, to say the least. It was the definition of a shell former. It literally took less than 10 seconds to transform. It had an awesome Freightliner Argosy Alt form, but a terrible robot mode with some horrendous back kibble. So once again, we'd definitely love to see Galvatron with hopefully some actual paint applied to the actual robot form as well. We've then got to see pretty much all of the Dinobot teams. So we need Scorn, we need Slug, we need Strafe. We haven't seen any Dinobots at all since Grimlock, who was originally released, I think, in 2018. So that's so long ago now. And considering how many Dinobots they're pumping out for the 86 movie line, it really does beg the question as to why we haven't seen any Dinobots at all for the live action films. I'm actually starting to think that maybe they have no intention in actually giving us them, as maybe they don't think they're going to sell well, but it's really quite surprising that we got Grimlock way back in 2018, but as far as the live action movie Dinobots are concerned, we've seen nothing at all. I'd also quite like to see an Age of Extinction variation of Ratchet. Of course, all they'd have to do would be to take Dark of the Moon Ratchet, maybe retool that rack on his back so that he doesn't have it dangling between the legs, and of course give him a dusty/rusty paint scheme. I think that could be quite a cool variant, and once again would harken back to some of the other figures I've discussed on the list in giving us an almost battle damaged variant of some of the pre-existing characters. I'd then also like to see Junk Heap. Now, Junk Heap, I actually think we saw a one-step battle changer of in the AOE toy line, so I actually think this one is definitely on the cards. It would be another one of those almost generic protoforms that we saw roaming around in Age of Extinction, but definitely a possibility. And I also believe we saw Junk Heap in Dark of the Moon very briefly. I'm sure I saw his vehicle mode when Starscream is trying to take down Sam Witwicky and of course Carly. And I'd also really like to see the two-headed version of Shockwave. Now, I think in regards to concept, it is just called two heads, but the two-headed Shockwave definitely had one of the most notable Decepticon designs in that movie, so I'd really love to see that. All they'd have to do would be just to retool the next section of the Dark of the Moon Shockwave to give him two heads, and literally you've got yourself the two-headed version of Shockwave. They'd also have to remove the arm cannon and give him a more generic normal arm, but other than that, I think it'd be a really simple repaint, and once again, a Decepticon that many collectors would in fact actually really like, myself included. And then rounding things off, in terms of a core class release, I'd actually really like to see Steeljaw. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Steeljaw, that was essentially the name given to some of Lockdown's wolves on his ship. I thought they had a cool design, really did give us one of the best sequences in that movie, of course, when all the humans are trying to, in fact, actually escape Lockdown's ship and make it on to some of those massive tall buildings. So, once again, it would be really, really cool to see Steeljaw. I'm more than likely missing a few characters off the Age of Extinction list, just as there were so many different protoforms in that movie that honestly it's impossible to in fact actually count them all, but those are the main figures that I'd love to see. And then as we jump to Transformers The Last Night, honestly we'll be here all day long as they've literally given us nothing for that at all. Now granted, in terms of actual live action movies, at the time the studio series launched, it was the most recent film, so it wouldn't really stand to reason to give us basically re-repeats of figures that we'd picked up maybe 12 months prior, but considering Last Night came out over 3 years ago now, I definitely think it's about time that we could see some reissues. So straight away, Nemesis Prime. This could be essentially just a slight repaint of the Night Optimus Prime that we'd get for the Age of Extinction line. The Last Night Bumblebee, once again, just a modified version of the Chimera. They could even take the Dark of the Moon version and retool that, as he did in fact actually have a very similar design in The Last Night to some of those first 3 Transformers movies. The Last Night Hound, this would have to be an extensive retool of the Oshkosh vehicles. Of course, he had a Mercedes in The Last Night, so it'd be a very, very different take on the vehicle mode, but the robot mode could essentially be the same. The Last Night Drift, as well as The Last Night Crosshairs. Of course, Drift was very different. He had a Mercedes as well instead of the Bugatti Veyron, whereas Crosshairs, I believe, was just an updated version of the Corvette, so they really wouldn't have to do all that much for him. I've also put on the list Squeaks. Now, to be honest, I actually really don't care if we ever see this guy. It wasn't a character that actually stood out to me in the movie, and to be honest, I'm pretty sufficed with the actual deluxe version that we got released as part of the original The Last Night toy line. I've merely packed him on here just as he was a character in the film, and I know that there'll be a few of you out there who maybe would like to see either a reissue of that original figure or perhaps a brand new figure entirely. Once again, I really don't care. If we are going to see a new figure, maybe put him in the core class, just as the deluxe class line is way too big for that character. I'd then also really like to see Day Trader. He had a very cool design in the movie, a massive character. Of course, also had a really distinguished looking vehicle mode as well. He essentially just picked up any pieces of junk that he could find, slapped it on his back. He was really awesome, and once again is a figure that I'm really hoping one day we can see. Then we turn it to Topspin / Volleybot. Now, to be honest, I'm really surprised that we haven't actually seen this guy yet, as he already basically exists. All they'd have to do would be to take Topspin from the Dark of the Moon line and basically just pack a Leadfoot head on, and boom, you've got yourself an actual Volleybot. Once again, a more obscure character, one that maybe is less likely to happen, but it would be a super easy repaint / retool for them to do, so I definitely think it's worth packing on this list. Then we turn to some of the more obscure Autobots that we mainly see patrolling around Anthony Hopkins' castle. So first off the bat would be Canopy. We see this guy towards the beginning of the movie. He's very quickly killed off. I don't actually know if we'd ever see. Maybe they could just take Long Haul, slightly retool Long Haul, and maybe slap some concrete on the back. But then in terms of actually turning him into a vehicle, practically, that could be a little challenging, especially considering that he never actually transformed in the film. But that hasn't stopped them in regards to the Bumblebee characters. To be honest, I don't really care if we ever see a Canopy figure. He was a character that was killed off very quickly, barely had any character either. So once again, not really looking forward to this guy at all. Then Bulldog. Now we in fact actually saw a Toy World version of Bulldog. I thought it was incredible, really amazing figure, so I can only imagine as to what the team over at Hasbro and Takara could produce. I thought we had a really cool looking robot mode, very cool looking tank mode, and despite him only appearing on screen for a very brief amount of time, I actually thought really stood out. Definitely gave me Revenge of the Fallen Jetfire vibes, so I do know he's a figure that many of you guys would like to see. Trench is also one that I'd like to see. He could merely just be a retool of Scrapper, in all honesty. They'd only have to change the arms, maybe the head, and you've got yourself a Trench. We see him very briefly when the Autobots are in fact evacuating their almost camp, when the Decepticons are just about to invade, so this also as a character I think is very easy to do, but once again is a little more obscure, so it really is just a matter as to whether or not they want to do him. Then we turn it to the Lieutenant. We very briefly see the Lieutenant, and then of course he trips over. We see him when I think it's the TRF are about to in fact actually evade Sir Anthony Hopkins' castle, and then of course Hot Rod, Cogman and Bumblebee roll out. He stacks over. He looks very similar to Jetfire. I personally really love to see him, maybe a deluxe class figure or core class. He didn't seem that big of a character at all, but we had a really interesting robot mode design. And then we jump to the Decepticons, and honestly they've given us none of these characters at all. So of course we'd have to see Megatron based on The Last Night in his night appearance, one of the best designs that I think a live action Megatron has seen so far. I'd then also really like to see an Onslaught. Why we never saw him in the original lineup, I had no idea at all. He had a wicked looking vehicle mode, and in all honesty, a pretty cool looking robot mode. They could essentially just take the robot form from long haul, retool that, but then once again, it would be a little too chunky to actually give us that long vehicle mode that he had in the film. I'd then also really like to see Barricade. The original version, in my opinion, just didn't cut it for me at all. I'd definitely like to see a complete brand new mold from head to toe. Of course, I believe I've already mentioned Hot Rod, this time in the Lamborghini mode instead of the World War II version. Then we turn it to another Decepticon, that being Mohawk. This would have to be a core class. Very, very cool character once again. Very distinctive looking robot mode. Definitely reminded me once again of Skids and Mudflap, and I think is a pretty easy figure they could try and pull off. We then also need a Dreadbot. He had a very cool robot form. They could essentially just take the crowbar that we saw as part of the Dark Moon toy line, retool or reshell the vehicle form in order to give us that old beaten up Volkswagen. And then wrapping up the Decepticons, we'd need Nitro Zeus, which could just essentially be a reissue of the Nitro that we saw in the original version, just repainted with at long last the proper accurate Shockwave head. And then finally Berserker, which would essentially just be a repack of Berserker that we saw as part of the original The Last Night toy line. And then rounding off here for the Last Night characters, Dragonstorm. Now, will we ever see a Dragonstorm? I think it's possible. Whether or not they'll just reissue the original leader figure that we saw is yet to be seen, but I would like to see something a little more ambitious. Maybe if they just scrap that entire combining gimmick overall and just give us one singular robot that turns into one dragon. I definitely think that was ultimately the original version's downfall, was that they tried to give us two knights, which just didn't quite cut it. Neither of the knights looked great, and then overall the dragon mode didn't look the best. So if they just stick to one dragon, one robot, I think that we could be looking at something really cool, and once again it could just fix some of those imperfections that we saw on the original version. We then also need some of the knights such as Stillbane and Skeletron. Whether or not they'll just be reissues of the original versions, in all honesty I don't really care, as I don't think they were great characters in the movie. And then rounding off for Transformers The Last Night, or at least the figures that I could think of, would have to be Infernicus. Now in all honesty, the Infernicus we got released originally was atrocious. I believe that it was essentially for the most part just a reissue, of course, in black of an Abominus or something that came out of the Transformers Prime Beast Hunters line. It's suffice to say it was really, really bad. It merely had one brand new retooled component, that being the chest, and to be honest, that was the only good thing about the entire figure. So to say that we need an Infernicus is honestly an understatement. We definitely need a reissue of this guy, a brand new figure. Maybe if they just do something that I've said with Dragonstorm, just give us one massive robot that transforms into some form of Cybertronian tank. They don't really even need to go all out on the entire combining aspect. And with an Infernicus, much like we saw with the original version, if they just package in a tiny crystallized version of Quintessa, in all honesty, I'll be really, really happy with that. So definitely, we need an updated Infernicus now more than ever, especially considering that we've concluded one of the biggest combiners to come out of the Bayverse, that being Devastator. Infernicus really is the only other combiner that we are yet to see from that particular movie saga. And then we jump into the Bumblebee movie. Now, in all honesty, if I'd recorded this video 6 months ago, we'd have so many figures to talk through, but they've pretty much given us all of them in one go as of the last month. So the only other figures yet to really be seen would be that of a Shockwave. We need Shockwave in a proper scale class, whether that be Leader or Voyager, and we need all of the different Seeker repaints. We need the other Coneheads, we need the other Seekers, such as Thundercracker and of course Skywarp, and maybe even the Rainmakers. In all honesty, I definitely think they're coming. It is just a matter of when and not if. So with all that being said, I believe that pretty much concludes every single Studio Series figure that I at least could think of that Hasbro and Takara are yet to give us, and I think it's pretty safe to say that we have so many to get through. So the Studio Series definitely has such a massive lifespan, and that's not even chucking in some of the 86 figures that they are yet to produce. So in all honesty, this is a line that we could see going for at least another 8, maybe even 10 years, especially with Transformers Rise of the Beasts. Honestly, this is going to be such a long line, maybe one of the longest live action movie lines of all time, and in all honesty, I'm so happy about that, as it is my favourite main line that is currently out there. That's also not even discussing some of the rumoured concept characters or game characters that Hasbro are also considering actually putting into this line, such as Warpath, maybe Breakaway. Honestly, there are so many they could do. So I'd really love to know down in the comment section below on what you guys thought of both the video as well as some of the characters that I included within this list. Are there any major ones that I missed out? Are there any ones on this list that you guys would really love to see them actually produce? And once again, be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. I thank you guys all so much for watching, and until my next video, I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.